The Dojo Challenge. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the small Los Angeles dojo, casting streaks of gold across the worn tatami. Bruce Lee adjusted the black belt around his waist, watching intently as his students practiced a sequence of kicks and punches. The air smelled of sweat and leather, mixed with the faint scent of menthol oil that some use to ease aches and pains after workouts. It was then that the door opened with a bang. Ed Parker, the founder of American Kenpo, entered with a firm step, accompanied by two of his most senior students. His face, marked by years of struggle and teaching, displayed an expression of unwavering confidence. Parker was a legend on the martial arts circuit, known for his precise technique and his ability to adapt Kenpo to the needs of real combat. But here, in that dojo, he wasn't just there for a cordial visit. "Bruce," Parker said, stopping a few feet away, arms crossed over his broad chest. "I heard that you are teaching your students to absorb what is useful and discard the rest. Interesting philosophy." Bruce raised an eyebrow, but remained calm. "That's what works for me," he replied, with a slight smile. "Each fighter has their own path." Parker shook his head, as if the answer didn't satisfy him. "It works for you doesn't mean it's superior. Kenpo has structure, logic, a response to each attack. You can improvise, but in the heat of the fight, refined technique always wins." Bruce's students stopped their training, their gazes alternating between the two masters. Some exchanged nervous whispers. Parker was not a man for social calls, he had come with a purpose. Bruce crossed his arms, imitating the visitor's posture. "Technique is important," he said, in a calm voice. "But rigidity can be a trap. A fighter must flow like water, adapt." "Water?" Parker laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Water doesn't break bones. Water does not knock an opponent down. Show me how your philosophy works in practice." A heavy silence fell over the dojo. Parker's students positioned themselves behind him, while Bruce's students moved back, making room. No one needed to say out loud what was about to happen. Bruce took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. He knew Parker's reputation, a ruthless fighter, a strategist who had transformed Kenpo into one of the most respected martial arts in the West. But Bruce also knew that his own journey had taken him down paths that went beyond the traditional ways. He was not just a practitioner, he was an innovator. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's see." Parker wasted no time. In one swift movement, he rushed forward, throwing a punch straight at Bruce's face. It was a classic Kenpo attack, calculated to test the opponent's reaction. But Bruce didn't move as expected. Instead of blocking or parrying in the traditional style, he tilted his body slightly to the side, letting his fist pass inches from his face. Instantly, his right hand shot out, grabbing Parker's wrist with surgical precision. With a quick spin, Bruce used the punch's own momentum against him, pulling Parker forward and knocking him off balance. Before the founder of Kenpo could recover, Bruce placed him in a headlock, forcing him to bend over. Parker resisted, trying to turn his body to escape, but Bruce had already changed position, releasing his arm and delivering a low kick that swept through his opponent's legs. Parker fell with a thud to the mat, but rolled immediately, rising to his feet in one fluid motion. "That was luck," Parker growled, brushing imaginary dust off his kimono. Bruce didn't respond. Just waited. This time, Parker didn't attack head-on. He circled, looking for an opening, and then unleashed a rapid sequence of punches and kicks, combining high and low strikes. Bruce dodged the first punch with a movement of his head, blocked the kick with his forearm and counterattacked with a palm strike that hit Parker's chest, pushing him back. The founder of Kenpo stepped back, breathing heavily. His eyes sparkled with a mix of frustration and respect. "You don't fight like a martial artist," Parker said, panting. "You fight like an animal." Bruce smiled. "An animal that has learned to move with purpose." Parker was silent for a long moment. Then, to everyone's surprise, he extended his hand. "Perhaps there is more to your philosophy than I thought." Bruce shook the offered hand, feeling the weight of the truce. It was not a surrender, but an acknowledgement. Martial arts were not a competition between styles, but a constant search for improvement. "Let's train together sometime," Parker said, before turning to leave. "Maybe I'll learn something new." Bruce nodded, watching as the founder of Kenpo left the dojo with his students. When the door closed, he turned to his own disciples, who stared at him in awe. "What it was?" he asked, with a smile. "Get back to training." And so, under the setting sun, the dojo once again echoed with the sound of rhythmic blows and breathing, as the lesson of that day was engraved in everyone's memory. True mastery was not in proving that a style was superior, but in understanding that each one had something to teach. The legacy of respect. The months that followed were marked by a subtle but profound change in Bruce's dojo. Parker's visit had not been forgotten, on the contrary, it had become a point of reference. Older students, previously so attached to the rigidity of Jeet Kune Do, began to question their own limits. Some, like Li Jun, a young prodigy with fast movements, began to incorporate Kenpo principles into their sequences, surprising Bruce with their unexpected fluidity. Others, like Mei Ling, a middle-aged woman who had been training for years, found in the dialogue between styles a new way of understanding self-defense, adapting techniques to their physical structure. Bruce, in turn, couldn't resist his curiosity. On a drizzling afternoon, he showed up at Parker's dojo, a modest space in Chinatown with walls covered in photos of old masters and a strong smell of liniment. Parker received him with a wide smile, as if he had been waiting for that moment. "I thought it would take longer," he said, throwing him a towel. "Come on, show me what you call formless art." The training was intense, not in the sense of brute force, but of exploration. Parker demonstrated how Kenpo used unexpected angles to dodge attacks, while Bruce countered with the economy of movement of Jeet Kune Do, forcing Parker to adapt. In the end, they were both sweaty, sitting on the floor with their backs against the wall, laughing like old friends. "You're good," Parker admitted. "But there's still a lot to learn." "And you too," Bruce replied, without rancor. That exchange was repeated several times, always in secret, away from the eyes of the students. It was as if they both knew that, for some, the idea of a master of one style learning from another was still taboo. But the truth is that the more they trained together, the more their arts influenced each other. Bruce began to incorporate more structured sequences into his teachings, while Parker began to emphasize the importance of adaptability. The real test, however, came unexpectedly. It was a cold winter night when three masked men broke into Bruce's dojo. These were no ordinary thieves, they moved with military precision, and their blows revealed training. One of them, the leader, used a variation of Shotokan karate, while the other two displayed dirty fighting techniques, probably learned in clandestine rings. The students, taken by surprise, retreated, but Bruce and Li Jun positioned themselves in front. The combat was chaotic. The invaders were not there to steal, but to humiliate. They wanted to prove that Jeet Kune Do was inferior to more traditional styles. Bruce blocked a roundhouse kick with minimal deflection, counterattacking with an elbow that hit the leader's solar plexus. The man staggered, but did not fall. It was then that Li Jun, inspired by Parker's teachings, used a Kenpo sequence to immobilize one of the attackers, twisting his arm at a painful angle. The third attacker, seeing his companions at a disadvantage, drew a knife. Bruce didn't hesitate. In a fluid movement, he dodged the blow with a rotation of his body and applied a side kick that threw the man against the wall. The sound of the blade falling to the ground echoed throughout the dojo. The invaders, now disarmed and defeated, were handed over to the police. But the episode left a mark. The next morning, Bruce gathered his students. "Yesterday, you saw how dangerous rigidity can be," he said, looking at each of them. "A style that doesn't adapt is a dead style. Parker taught me this, and now you know it too." Li Jun, still with a bruise on his arm, raised his hand. "Master, what do we do now?" Bruce smiled, taking a piece of chalk and drawing two interlocking circles on the blackboard. Now, we train to be more than just fighters of a single style. We train to be complete. The endless path. Years passed, and Bruce's dojo became a meeting place for martial artists of all backgrounds. Parker, already elderly, often showed up for informal training sessions, and the two masters developed a friendship that transcended their initial rivalry. His students, in turn, fused techniques, creating unique variations that belonged to no specific style, only the individual. Bruce never abandoned the principles of Jeet Kune Do, but he learned to value the structure of Kenpo, the precision of Wing Chun, the strength of Muay Thai. And, above all, he learned that true martial art was not in winning debates about which style was better, but in using every tool available to become stronger, wiser, more human. One autumn afternoon, as the sun turned the dojo gold, Bruce looked at his students, some young, others already graying their hair, and felt that his work was complete. Not because he had created a new style, but because he had taught them that the path had no end. What matters is not the name of what we do, he said, closing his eyes for a moment, but how we live what we learn. And with that, the sound of blows began again, echoing as it always had, but now carrying with it the weight of a lesson that would last generations. Legacy beyond the shadows. The years following that autumn afternoon were marked by an eerie stillness in Bruce's dojo. Not the stillness of abandonment, but that which precedes a storm of meaning. The students, once eager for techniques and disputes, now moved with deliberate calm, as if each step carried the weight of something greater. Some, like Mei Ling, the young woman who had arrived at the training with her fists clenched and her heart full of rage, had become instructors in their own right. Others, like Old Shin, who had only sought out Wing Chun to alleviate the pain of age, discovered that the martial art was, after all, a dance with mortality itself. Bruce, however, felt that something was still missing. Not in your students, but in yourself. He had spent his life teaching that strength was not just in the blows, but in the ability to absorb the world without breaking. And yet there was a question that haunted him, silent as a shadow: what comes after teaching everything you know? It was one spring morning, when the cherry trees in the dojo garden were blooming in shades of pale pink, that the answer arrived. Not in the form of a grand revelation, but through an unexpected visitor. A tall man with broad shoulders and old scars on his forearms entered the room without warning. He wore a shabby gi, and his eyes, dark as coal, carried an intensity that made the younger students instinctively recoil. Bruce, however, recognized him immediately. It was Kato, an old rival from the times when they both toured the underground fighting circuits in Japan. Kato had never been a man of words, but of actions, and his actions, at the time, had been brutal. "I heard you stopped fighting," Kato said, his voice hoarse as if he had spent years in silence. Bruce smiled, without tension. "And you heard right. Then it's true. You have become a sensei." "Not exactly. A guide, perhaps." Kato crossed his arms, assessing the dojo with a critical eye. "And what does a guide do when there is nothing else to guide?" The question echoed in the empty hall. Bruce didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked to the center of the mat and assumed a basic Wing Chun stance, hands open as if expecting an attack. Kato understood the invitation. With a fluid movement, he advanced, delivering a punch straight to Bruce's chest. The coup never arrived. Bruce dodged with a slight rotation of his body, using the energy of the attack to spin and position himself behind Kaito. There was no counterattack. Just a tense silence, broken only by the controlled breathing of both. "You still fight," Kaito observed, slowly turning around. "I still feel it," Bruce corrected. "Fighting is just one way of feeling." Kaito let his guard down, something Bruce had never seen him do in combat. "I came here because I heard you found something I never could." "And what would that be?" "Peace." Bruce laughed, a light, genuine sound. "Peace is not something that can be found. It's something that is built. Every day." Kaito was silent for a long moment. Then, without warning, he knelt on the mat, hands resting on his knees. "Teach me." It wasn't a request. It was a recognition. Asterisk. The months that followed were transformational. Kito, who had arrived at the dojo a man broken by the violence he had inflicted and suffered, became a constant presence. Not as a student, but as a mirror. Where Bruce taught fluidity, Kato brought rigidity. Where Bruce spoke of compassion, Kato questioned the usefulness of mercy. And yet, it was precisely this tension that enriched the dojo. Mei Ling, who previously saw fighting as a form of revenge, began to understand that true strength lay in knowing when not to fight. Chin, the elder, discovered that his aching joints were not a limit, but a reminder that each movement must be precise, as the body was unforgiving of waste. And the youngest students, those who arrived full of questions and little patience, learned that the answers did not come from techniques, but from observing the world, and themselves, carefully. Bruce, in turn, found something in Kaito that he didn't know he needed, a lively challenge. Not an opponent, but a man who forced him to look at his own contradictions. After all, how can we teach nonviolence when the martial art itself was, in essence, training for conflict? How can he talk about humility when he himself had once been an arrogant fighter? It was on a full moon night, when the dojo was empty and only the two of them remained in the hall, that Kaito finally broke the silence. Have you ever thought about what it will be like when you're no longer here? Bruce, who was adjusting the training bands, stopped. Every day. And what will happen to what you built? It's not mine to control. Martial arts belong to no one. They are like the wind, they pass through anyone willing to feel them. Kaito nodded, as if that answer resolved something inside him. Then you are not afraid. Afraid of what? Of being forgotten. Bruce set the banner aside and looked at his friend. Fear is not the problem. The problem is letting him decide for you. I don't teach to be remembered. I teach because it's what I know how to do. And because, as long as there is someone willing to learn, what I know still has value. Kaito smiled, for the first time in years. You always had too many answers. And you always asked too many questions. Asterisk. The end came without warning, as it often does. Bruce was in the dojo garden, pruning the cherry trees, when he felt a sharp pain in his chest. It wasn't a sudden attack, but a slow pressure, as if something inside him was slowly breaking apart. He leaned against the tree trunk, taking a deep breath, and smiled. There was no fear. Just a strange clarity. When Mei Ling found him, he was sitting on the ground, his back against the cherry tree, his eyes closed. She ran to him, her heart racing, but Bruce held up a hand, reassuring her. It's okay, he said, his voice calm. It's just the end of a cycle. Don't talk like that, she asked, her eyes teary. Why not? It's the truth. And the truth doesn't have to be sad. Kaito arrived soon after, bringing old Chin and some of the older students with him. They gathered around Bruce, silent. There were no suitable words. Just the presence. Remember, Bruce said, looking at each of them. Martial art is not about winning. It's about continuing. Even when the body fails, the spirit does not need to stop. And then, as if he had waited just for that moment, he closed his eyes and never opened them again. Asterisk. The dojo did not close. Mei Ling assumed leadership, but not as a successor, but as a guardian. Kaito, who had never considered himself a teacher, discovered he had a lot to teach, not about scams, but about how to carry the weight of the past without letting it crush you. Chin, with his hands shaking, continued to train, because he realized that the fight against time was the most honest of all. And on nights when the wind was strong, the younger students swore they could hear the sound of footsteps on the empty mat. Not as a ghost, but as a reminder, the path had no end. Only those willing to walk it.